Quads today?
Yeah. Okay. So
Uh,
I just
It
press record on yours too, Regan.
I
don't tell me
press
what to do.
and it requests permission from you, Mike, because you're the host. You have
Oh,
to
really?
apparently.
I don't know if I should. How do I?
Uh,
I don't know. It says
Well,
recording.
I'm recording, so
Mike, do you have a lazy eye?
stop video. Hold on. Oh, allow recording. Okay, got it. Allow record.
I'm recording.
Nice. Sam, are you recording?
Recording too, yeah.
Doesn't say you are, Regan. Sam, you can see it.
Mm.
You lied to me. You lied to the host. All right, let's do this. All right, so this is our first meeting. All right, on a Sunday. Figured it'd be cool to do something like this on every Sunday, but may not happen. We'll see about the consistency. We discussed talking about deloads. I also put in tapering and peaking. I think the first thing that we should do is maybe introduce ourselves. Regan, you could start.
My name's Regan. Currently a strength coach at the University of Providence.
My name is Sam. I'm currently a coach at Marshall University.
You want to know mine? Well, I was a previous strength coach. Now I'm a personal trainer for special populations, mostly the elderly population. But we'll see what ends up happening. Hopefully I can get back into it. Right, guys?
Right.
Sure.
A few more of these talks and you might be back in it.
All right. So anyways, the first question I have on here is, what is your definition of a deload? Sam, you can go. What do you got?
For me, deload week would usually be at the end of a training phase, before the next training phase, and it's used to take a break from a stimulus that you might be using in your training, so that you can kind of give your body and your CNS chance to recover before the next training phase.
Okay. Cool. What about you, Regan? What is your definition, buddy?
Short plan period to recover whatever adaptation you were training for in the previous phase.
Okay.
Doesn't necessarily mean it's an easy week of training. It's just taking a break from what you were focusing on previously in preparation for something else.
Okay. I like those. Let me see where mine is. Well, I think that we can all agree it's definitely a planned period of time where there's a reduction in the training volume. Some people even do it intensity, where hopefully there's that what's the word, super compensation effect that ends up happening, right? Like where you get to intensification type of phase with our training, and then a reduction, and hopefully we can spike back up to a new training level, whether that be for competition or competition mostly, right? So that would be the only reason we would end up doing that. I don't really know. Maybe you guys can butt in on this. The difference between like maybe a deload and a taper. Maybe Regan, you have a better idea.
I'd say, yeah. I mean, either way, they still have the same objective, I think, to a degree. But deload's more so allowing for recovery, and you're not as worried about maybe those other qualities that would be important for the sport. So you're okay with letting like fitness drop off because the main goal is recovery. Versus a taper, depending on your sport, for the most part, you keep that intensity high during the taper, but you just gradually drop the volume. And I think with the taper too, you're using a lot more daily measurements like vertical jump or whatever to like get a read on how your athlete is recovering while you're like how your athlete's performance is handling the taper.
I would agree with that. I also think when I think of a taper, I think that that is for you taper for a specific event or competition, whereas A deload is just like,
Can happen anytime.
exactly, it's just a part of the longer training process, I would say.
Process.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Mike, I got a question.
What?
So you said deloading for competition to prepare for competition. How does deload apply with the special population?
It doesn't. It doesn't really. I don't think you really
It's not
can.
even
Actually,
necessary.
I'll tell you what though. Actually, so based on like kind of what we use, there are different protocols in there, right? It's still progressive resistance training, but for them, you're not going to see like I would almost kind of compare them a little bit to like the untrained type of population in a way, right? Though they will push themselves, and I think the younger, more type 2 type of fiber people versus the type 1 older, because with them, the older population, they're fighting sarcopenia, like they're losing fiber, type 2 fibers especially. So some of the younger people might have to, the higher training age, younger, might need to deload more often. But in the way that I do it, it's not really even a planned period of what's it called, like a planned period of adjustments that need to happen. We just switch over to like a different protocol. That might be, but
It's kind of like,
it's only twice a week too. So they're training for the most part, like training twice a week, even though it is pretty intense for them because it is percentage based training. I don't even know if a deload's necessary, but I've had the point where the people have plateaued with a certain program, and then I might run through like it's called like the focus program. It's just an easier type of program I might use for a week, like 2 days for them, and then might try something harder to see if there's any increases in their performance. But there are some people I've never done a deload for, and then we retest their isometric strength, and they're still seeing increases. So I don't really know. Couldn't really answer that question, but I've definitely seen like people almost get to the point where they plateaued, and I just switched their program to something a little bit easier for a week, and then revved it back up.
so it's more day to day than
Yeah,
anything.
that's all. That's all. Now next question, what we got? It is kind of cool working with some of the older clientele, though. It's a lot different, that's for sure. All right. When did you first hear about a deload? Like, when did you first discover like this was an actual thing that needed to happen in training?
Go for it, Sam.
I think for me as an athlete, I feel like I remember being in a deload week and being like, what's going on here? Why are we doing this? And my strength coach kind of explaining, well, we're taking this week a little bit lighter. It's a deload week. And I was like, what's that? And then he kind of explained it. And I feel like to me at the time, and I see this with athletes now, they're like, well, why are we doing that? Like we just want to get after it, especially if it's in the off season. And so kind of explaining that to me back then was big. And I feel like that's something I come into now as well. When with your athletes who the ones who really want to get after it, they sometimes don't want to take a week where they want to drop a set or reduce the load on that big lift or whatever it might be. And so that's definitely part of it as well. But yeah, that would be when I first heard of it back when I was an athlete, back in the day.
What about you, Regan?
When I was in high school, I remember I was doing like singles on deadlifts every single week for a summer, and I just tried to increase it to 10 pounds every single week. And then like one week, I had one of those really sticky deadlifts where you barely get it all the way up. I don't even remember what the weight was. And then I remember going back to it the next week and trying to beat it, and then I couldn't beat it for like 4 or 5 weeks, and so I decided to start reading about it, and that's when I figured out what a deload was and what the purpose was. But it was many years until I actually decided that I needed to use it.
Yeah.
After making a lot of
That's
poor
the
training.
CrossFit mentality.
It is. Even before I started the CrossFit.
All right. Well, the first time I heard about it, I heard about it at Easter. It was during my first internship, and I saw it on a program and I was like, "What the heck is this like fourth week of this like easiness? Like why is this so easy for this like fourth week? Like what is this garbage? And then it was Coach Aaron Short that told me about it, and he said like this is a planned period of time, like where they do less volume and their intensity drops. He did both, I believe, with his athletes, but it always depends. But that's the first time I saw it. And then I continuously from there on after, I saw different programs that had that fourth week of training that would be like lower. And I was like, what is this? Then I started to understand. We had a couple of internship like meetings that explained it. And I was like, okay, I get it. I'll start using these. But it was really just like something I was told to do. And I really didn't know what it was at first. But it wasn't until like I got my first job in which I tried it, and then I could see the benefits from it. And that's when you actually see the benefits of it, is when you apply it, not just to yourself, but to other people as well, or the athletes.
Hey, so how did you guys first apply deloads with athletes, and how has it changed since that first time you applied it? How have you gone about programming it differently? I think that'd be a cool thing to talk about.
For me, I would say like when I first figured out that a deload is something that makes sense and the athletes need to use it, I was like, all right, every fourth week, my athletes are going to deload. But then I think slowly as I've gotten more coaching experience, I think that it's obvious that some athlete populations might require a deload week or period of time, and other athletes may not. And so one example that sticks out to me is most recently, like working with female athletes, I feel like sometimes don't necessarily need as much of a deload. And it may just be because they can handle more volume or maybe need more volume or both of those things. And so I just feel like, let's say we're in the third week and on their main lift, they're getting down to, like a 5x3 or a 6x3 or something like that. And it looks really good. And it doesn't look like, like you said earlier, they're struggling to pull the bar off the ground or whatever it might be. And so in that case, I don't think that like you need to deload. And I've seen that more with female athletes. And so something I've done there is kind of deload just in a different way, like maybe take a set or take some reps off of some accessory exercises because they just don't need to deload in the same way as, let's say, again, from my experience, a male athlete who is maybe lifting more weight. And I've seen that on their main lift, they do get to a point more often where it's like, that doesn't look as good and they need to really cut back a little bit more. So I would just, that's kind of like a very generalized example, but I just think that sometimes certain athletes may not need as much of a deload as others. And so that's a way in which I've kind of changed it. It's not just like a set thing now, like every fourth week, everyone's deloading. I think it changes depending on the kind of athlete, maybe their training experience as well, how trained they are. Maybe a more trained athlete who's hitting heavier loads and training at higher intensity might need more of a deload than another athlete who's earlier on in their training experience and is still, can handle the volume and needs the volume.
Yes, I agree. The first time I used it was at UNF when I first got the coaching experience. And I remember the first time I did it, was just 3x5, 3 sets of 5 at the end of it, whatever phase it was, didn't matter what phase it was. And then there was a reduction it was like 50% on everything, that was the intensity. And then I just continuously did that, and that's what I did, because that's all I knew about a deload. Then you start to get more experience, and then you start to realize like, oh, I can manipulate these variables a little bit differently. And then you start to research like what are the proper ways to deload. And then you start to realize that intensity is really the biggest factor. For the most part, not to say that is, because I've heard different stories about, or different theories in terms of like, during a high intensity phase, maybe you should cut back on intensity, or during a high volume phase, you should cut down on volume, and vice versa. It's all theory based for that, for the most part, from what I understand. But since then, I do know that maintaining intensity is probably the biggest factor. So with that being said, I cut down now if I'm going to do it, whether it's online programming or what I did in the past near the end of the GA, was like about 30%. So I'd be cutting out like one set in terms of the volume. So if there's like 3 sets of 10, it would be like 1 set of 10. Or sorry, 2 sets of 10 or 2 sets of 12, something along those lines. And that would be for all the assistance or accessory exercises, and then the main lift. If it was like a 4x5, I would do like a 2x5, and I'd cut down the percentage from anywhere from 30 to 40%. And it was all like experimenting. It's all it was. It was just trying different things with different people. And then back to the females versus males. I do believe it's a fact, right, that males or sorry females, their 3 RM is like closer to their 1 RM, right?
Yeah.
And then also with that being said, I guess that kind of like their perception of like what a max effort is might throw that deload off maybe if they're missing. But most importantly, and it's another like weird thing to talk about, but menstrual cycle is actually I think something to take into account if you're doing it personal in terms of like personal training, right? I think that's something to take into account when you're going to deload a female. I have nothing else to say about that, but that's all I know when it comes down to that. In competition, I'm sure some very high-level strength coaches do take that into account when they're programming. I really haven't done that much in terms of team sports, but I'm sure that is a variable that plays into it. Cool. All right, next question is.
Hey, I'll go.
All right.
Yeah, so deloading at first, like I said, I didn't really do it, and I guess kind of stubborn when I'm training and think you can handle, and then think as long as the athletes' numbers are going up or whatever you're training for is improving, and we weren't deloading, I kind of didn't see the purpose in doing it because
Yeah.
their performance looked like it was continually improving, but and I know Mike's talked about this too, his first year with baseball at Belmont, and I can compare it to my first year with softball at Belmont. We pushed him really hard, like Mike did APRE, right, Mike? Is that what you did? Yeah. So, yeah, he was pushing his guys hard. I was doing open sets on my third week, pushing volume, pretty heavy and high intensities with those compound lifts, and saw a huge improvement over the course of the semester. But kind of came around and bit me in the butt during the season once it caught up to him. And not that we necessarily had many injuries, but we had a lot of girls complaining about nagging things, especially like hips and low back. And that was probably just because I continued to push them with those axial loading movements like the back squat over and over and over. And even though they were getting better, just because they could squat like 50 more pounds than they could week 1, week 12, they weren't necessarily better at softball. Yeah, so then I guess I went out to Minnesota for an internship, came back, and instead of basing my periodization off strength qualities, I shifted to like a energy system bias. So what we do for deloads is we would literally just drop all the weights and just do circuits with like 20 or 30 pounds at most for a week, and that give them a break from the intensity. Yes, the volume would stay high, and we weren't necessarily cutting that down, but the intensity was so low. They were recovering from a neural standpoint, which is what we were pushing for the most part with athletes like them. So
Yeah.
I think as long as you change the emphasis from phase to phase, and you're not just being stubborn and thinking like you're training yourself because you love lifting weights and they don't. I think you're fine as long as you're changing that training emphasis. And like if you go from a volume phase to an intensity phase, you don't deload by dropping the intensity. You deload by dropping the volume because that's what you were pushing previously.
Yeah.
So as long as like you're switching, as you switch phases, you're deloading whatever what was focused on previously, I think you're fine. And something else I done this previous year was deloaded just by programming movements that they couldn't lift as heavy as on. So
Yeah.
like, yeah, and Sam, you mentioned that when we talked about this the other day. Like, if we're doing trap bar deadlifts for our lower body push, we're just doing a bit more squatty version. If we switch to front squats, the intensity is gonna be much lower just because they can't go as heavy on that movement.
Yeah.
And they're not holding their weight in the hands, so it's not as neural. So like you can use movements to control the intensity of the exercise also to allow deload.
Yeah. I feel like you see that all the time in programs. An example I think of is, like putting fat grips on a bar for a deadlift or something like that. It cuts down, and to the athlete or to you, whoever's doing it, it might feel like it's still like a max effort because you're trying really hard, but you're not going to get anywhere. It's something that doesn't allow you to get to anywhere near the intensity that you would normally.
And I think it's awesome to do that too, just because like it never teaches the athlete there's an easy training day or like, oh, this is an easy week. Like
Yeah.
you can still put the effort forth, but you're still deloading because the intensity of the lift can't be as high, just physically can't be.
Yeah. And that's why another reason why I like, you mentioned using circuits and talking about from an energy system point of view. I think it also gives the athlete, when we're talking about, let's say we're talking about a college or a high school athlete, someone who's, their whole life isn't just like training and in the weight room. After 3 or 4 weeks, a week of doing something like circuits is actually a nice mental break for them as well. But at the same time, it's not easy. They're still getting hard work in as well.
Yeah, change to taxing a different system.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
All right, what do we got, Mike?
So one of my questions was, what useful tools have helped you plan a deload? Like, I know it's a weird question, but like, I only wanted to say that because remember how like we were talking about, I don't know if you remember this when we were in our little small cubbyhole office. That like, remember when I was like, hey, like one way you guys can do it, and I thought it was like the coolest thing ever is like you give somebody a handshake and you see their grip and you see how fatigued they are. I was thinking more like fatigue measures. Like, what fatigue measures do you use to like judge a deload? Whether that's like sports sciencey type of stuff or like a look, a feel. Like, what do you use?
Sam, you want to go or you want me to go?
I can go. I think I've used jumping in the past. Most recently, I've talked to Regan a lot about this. Like, I think there's a lot of value in performing a test on a more regular basis than just like on a testing day. So
Yeah.
let's say it's a vertical jump, or let's say you just want to pair a jump with something at the start of a training session. If you can get a measurement for that and get a number for it, then that gives you something that you can track over time, and that's definitely something that you can use to look at and think, this athlete might be ready for a deload week. It could be sprint time, it could be a throw, but something where you have a number and you can see it trending up and then trending down. I mean, that's something that can definitely help you in planning something like a deload week for sure.
I'm thinking about doing some jumps with Betty, the 90-year-old trainer with osteoporosis,
Yeah.
and see if that's a good measure, you know.
Get her RSI, her reactive strength index on her depth jump.
Might have to find a different method for.
Yeah, maybe balance. Maybe we can start with that.
You going, Mike?
Yeah, mine was just like the old school ways, the like handshake, just kind of seeing like body language when they're talking with you. Just doing like I did remember the in season kind of questionnaire that I used too. I know Vanderbilt, like the guy over there, was doing like a daily questionnaire type of thing, like right when they woke up in the morning, like
Bacon?
this type of questionnaire to see how they were all doing. Yeah, right.
Go. Okay, so when I'm using those things, the like fatigue indicators, or whatever you're saying. So I think like if you're using those too, and you're actually following what you're getting, that means you can't say like, oh, we're deloading week 4. That basically means like you have a program that's open and like open to change. For like, if you're using indicators and you're actually following them, you have to be willing to change your program based on the reads you're getting on your athletes. And I haven't been anywhere long enough to see athletes for beyond a year, I think, to really be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I usually, what I used at Providence this past year is we had the G flights to get a counter movement jump and RSI on their depth jumps. And I did the testing the whole year on the softball team is because I knew my wrestlers wouldn't really be into it, and I've had a feel. I used it on the women's wrestling, but their fatigue levels were all over the place just from cutting weights. So I never really did much with that because I only had them for 1 year.
Uh-huh.
But with the softball in the off season, if they had shitty jumps, I just kept rolling with the program because it didn't really matter because they didn't have to compete. Maybe I would take some volume off the last lift of the week and let it factor into next week a little bit. But in season with softball this year, obviously got cut off short, but we were making changes to volumes on our main lift for the 2 weeks based on what jumps we were getting on Mondays. So, but the year also got cut down in half.
Yeah.
So
I would always just and I like one thing I did was too is I would just ask like some of the older guys, like or some of the older athletes, like, hey, like what do you think? Give me your honest opinion about like how you guys are doing, and then they would kind of give me feedback on that too. But it's always like so there's so many variables, like just like everything else that you try to control that you really can't. It's too difficult. It's really just a athlete to athlete or person to person type of thing, really, when it comes down to the deload.
That's what makes it so hard when it's as well,
Yeah.
because like it's athlete to athlete, and you've 20 different athletes, and you
your
have
seniors are way different than your freshmen.
What they're eating, how they're sleeping, all plays a role in the deload too. And then what was it? And then like remember we do them and we try to schedule them around like finals and like midterms and stuff like that when it was high stress for them as well.
yeah.
We do try to plan our deloads around that time as well, even though it's like wasn't mandatory. We'd still get our workouts in, but they would. I remember you doing your circuits during that time, Regan, and then we would remember the one time I did like max effort testing during
I remember
good
that.
deload time.
Hey, if they're under stress anyway, that might be another way to look at it. They're under stress, just give it to them all.
Or stress.
It's a really high week all
Yeah.
around.
And then
Exactly.
the following week would be a taper or a deload.
Hey, Mike, I got something. Do you remember when you were training women's soccer and they got stronger from deloading all the time?
Yeah, they did it. Dude, so I was looking into that a little bit. That's that guy Jake Tura, right? So I kind of thought I was thinking about this a little bit too. I wish I could look it up, or I
Hey,
think
is it the type 2 fibers from rest?
it has to
Is that what
do
you're
with
talking
type 2
about?
fibers. So you guys know this already too. I think it was something we learned in like our undergrad. Type 2 fibers, sedentary people, like obese people that sit around all the time, essentially, and I believe this is legit, have higher type 2 fibers, correct?
I think it's a higher percentage. I don't think you know what I mean, like percentage of the muscle.
Percentage of it versus people that are more conditioned. Because when you become more conditioned with strength training, right, you really become more oxidative in a way. So those type 2s can become more oxidative. So with that being said, like, then you have to take into account, like, did they lose strength or was it the fiber type that changed or did their mass increase? Because mass also plays a role right into power as well too. I was thinking about this a little bit because I had a couple of clients that like we did testing too. Like we did new isometric testing right when they came back and that some of their numbers went up and they said they didn't do anything. But a lot of these people also gained like 15, 20 pounds because they're that vulnerable high risk population. So they gained weight, meaning they probably just more mass, more power, more strength, right? And maybe the type 2 fibers had something to do with it too. So maybe, I don't know if that has anything to do with the female athletes. I don't know. But maybe like a reduction in their training volume could have had an impact on that, because there's different, think about it too. When you look into some of these studies with tapers, some of them can go pretty far out too, like weeks on weeks on weeks out, like, and some of them are like a complete detraining period. I'm sure you can look into where they saw performance increases after a complete detraining period. So there's
Maybe
lots of stuff out there that it's kind of hard to put on that. But I think one thing might be the type 2 fiber change, maybe.
and also I think especially with soccer, college soccer programs, a lot of coaches have no grasp or grip on how much volume they're putting their athletes through. And
Yeah.
maybe those girls were so worn down by the end of the off season or by the end of their season, when you were just taking it easy on them for a while, they were actually able to recover and like their body to be able to get back to normal functioning level. Just because, that soccer volume's crazy. Where some coaches don't have any idea what they're doing.
Here's one. What we did. Any interesting ways you performed a deload? Like, are there any interesting ways you performed a deload in the past? Like, I think we might have went over this a little bit, but anything. Well, I'll tell you, one of mine was like just free. I know there's another way to do it. Is like you can manipulate just frequency. So instead of training, instead of just always playing with the variables or like energy system. Like mine was just frequency. Like instead of training 4 times that week, like I trained 2 or 3 times that week instead. That was just, it's not really an interesting way of doing it, but it's just a different way of doing it. I've also seen a personal benefit from.
I've also seen something more recently, which is new to me, but makes a lot of sense. Let's say you're training 5 times a week and you have your big lift at the start and then have a bunch of accessory lifts, and they might still be using a barbell, but they're just not like exactly what you're training for. And then like the 4th week or 5th week or 6th week or whatever it is, you're going heavy on that first lift, and it's actually, so you could actually call it like a max week, but then you just completely drop the accessory. So all you're doing that week is going for those max lifts, but you've cut the volume down so much that it's absolutely a deload week. You just wouldn't think that it is, because like you're actually really pushing hard every day. So from a volume point of view, it makes sense, but then when you think of it from like a CNS point of view, it's probably not. So that was something that I hadn't seen before. I used it for a bit of my own training, and I think for me it worked, just dropping the volume out completely. But I wonder if my CNS would have probably not recovered going into that next week.
Something I've done is I actually just flip the accessories in the main lift.
Mm.
So I push my accessories harder, and then my main lift is kind of my accessory for the day, where I'm just like keeping that movement pattern groove.
Yeah.
I think that works really well, because typically your accessories are targeting those lagging muscle groups or whatever you struggle with, that will carry over to whatever you're focusing on. So I think taking like a week or two to focus on those lagging lifts, and then just greasing the groove on the movement pattern with something a little bit lower intensity at the end, is also another way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think time warranted too. Like you can just do, if you have like an A, B, C, D block, you just do like A and B and you're out,
Yeah.
something like that. And just still crush your 2 main lifts, but not do any of the assistance or accessories, and just get in and out, and keep the intensity high, but the duration short. Like duration would be one. All right. So I looked into some, were you able to look into any studies, Sam?
No.
Okay, well, I got some cool ones, so I'll go over some of the studies. I found this book. I read majority of this book because it was very boring to read, but it's called Tapering and Peaking for Optimal Performance. That was a really good book, and I got some studies out of that one. And here's some. It's more or less like some of the benefits from doing a deload in terms of the physiological benefits, and here are some. Even if you go on, what's it called? What is it? Here's the one out of the NSCA Strength Conditioning Journal off of T Nation. So I copied and pasted this one off T Nation, which is actually a pretty good source. These were some of the benefits: up to 20% increase in strength and power. These are from actual research studies. Increases in muscle cross-sectional area of 10 to 25%, mostly from glycogen source, is what they're saying. Lower levels of stress hormone, that's going to be cortisol. Increased levels of testosterone, and then, believe it or not, better mood. And then the better mood came from, in the book that I was reading, came from like a questionnaire. It's called a POMS questionnaire, and it just did mood state, and I think it was college swimmers, and they saw like decreases in depression, like anxiety. Like they really went into a lot of mental health type of questions too. Here it was: perceived fatigue, depression, anger, and confusion. And they saw all decreases after a 4-week taper, while there was also an increase in vigor. So I guess like the willingness to do things, or so that was like mood state. So I thought that was really cool, along with some studies show an increase in REM sleep, the rapid eye movement. Here was a cool one too. You guys know about the creatine kinase. That's a indicator of muscle damage. It's an enzyme. That's
Rhabdo.
Yeah, rhabdo. It's very similar. Yes, that's what I was going to say. So rhabdo is associated with that, and increased myoglobin in the blood, which can cause kidney damage. So like those two will be elevated when you're training like a maniac, pretty much. So there's an increase decrease in overall creatine kinase circulating through the blood, but that did not necessarily mean there was any improvements in performance in some of the studies. So just there was no correlation. Even though there was a decrease, so it mean that they were well rested and recovered, didn't necessarily mean they were going to do better. I told you about the increased glycogen levels, and that's good. I guess if you're going to hit a new block of training, so you're ready to go. Here we go. Oh, this was the one with the cortisol values. Study by college swimmers were resting. Cortisol levels declined by 23 to 30%, and the testosterone concentration increased by 22% during the first taper, and the athlete's competition performance improved by an average of 3.2% in two different 2 to 3 week tapers within a season. So there's definitely some research that supports that testosterone cortisol type of balance, and that cortisol level, most important, like whenever you're stressed, I don't care what kind of stress it is, those are going to be elevated, right? So during conference, it's always like good to do that, and especially for men with those testosterone levels, right, for performance. That's pretty much all I got with their studies. I just picked out a few that kind of make sense to people.
I got something.
What?
Overtraining or under recovering?
Yeah, right. That's a tough one. I don't know. I don't really know if you can ever really see. I don't know. You know, right? That's really what it comes down to, though, right?
Yeah.
What we're talking about, it's an independent variable type of situation. Like you're gonna get here's the double-edged sword, right? You're gonna get a young athlete that's like 18 years old that you can probably push them a little bit harder, but they have nowhere near the nutrition education as somebody that's a senior, right? So there's that balance. Like that's why like all your freshmen you'll see, all the freshmen that you see, freshmen's all the freshmen that you see all get what like every year there's like a group of them that get what's that not pink eye but they get what is that where they're like chronically tired, what was it that Hubble got?
Strep throat? I don't know. I don't remember.
What is it when you get like really sick? Come on.
Mono.
That was mono.
I remember that.
And then it's just like every year there's some freaking group of athletes that get mono because they're not recovering properly. And then pink eye. It's like the grossest living situation ever. But think about it. There's some sort of immune response from like training too hard or not eating too well, right? And I think that's really what it comes down to is you can push these athletes really hard in the weight room and on the field, but if they're not eating right, like that deload needs to happen more often. Essentially.
So what is it? Overtraining or under recovering?
I know. Well, that's why you do the deload every 4th week just in case, right? That's why I did it.
What do you think, Sam?
Under recovery.
I agree.
Yeah.
You gotta eat, you gotta sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think too.
Going off what Mike was talking about, I also think like an important thing, especially in like a college setting, or not just college setting, anytime you're working with an athlete who is training outside of when they're just with you, trying to like coordinate the deload week in the weight room or from a strength training perspective with everything else they're doing is huge, obviously, because it's a deload training week, not like a deload lifting week is what it should be. But that's probably the biggest challenge, I think, in all of this, because you could deload a group of athletes, but their sports coach is like choosing that week to be a week, or he's not choosing that week to it, but one day he just shows up and decides, he's going to run them for the whole session, and then that's your deload week out of the window. So I think planning ahead and where you can, sitting down with whether it's the athlete and talking about what else they're going to be doing that week, or whether it's the sports coaches and talking about what else they're going to be doing that week, because if he's not planning for it, or he or she is not planning for it to be a deload week, then it might be pointless you setting aside that week if the next week or the week after that is going to work better as a deload week. So I know like we talk a lot because we see it a lot, like the 4th week of a training block being a deload week, but that may not always be the best case. And like you said earlier, a program where you can change and you're willing to look at maybe statistics or whatever it might be, numbers, and change it as it's going is probably the right way to go. But it's just so hard because, like you said, you have to have them for a long time, and you have to have good relationships.
Your only team.
Yeah, but
I have
going off
110
going off what you were saying, Sam, is yeah, just having like a high-low model with your coach.
Yeah.
Like with wrestling, I knew every Monday it was like our technique day, and then every Tuesday we were gonna ramp them up. Wednesday drop them back down. Then Thursday was the big weight cut practice. So Monday was our upper body day.
Yeah.
Like yeah, we were benching heavy, but that's still not that much intensity compared to other lifts. And then Tuesday would be like our trap bar day, and then Wednesday we would maybe doing some unilateral work, just lining it up with your coach.
Yeah.
And then I think too, like, because I don't think any sport coach ever gives a full deload week during practice, you know. And I think if you like do your highs and lows like a couple days a week, every week, and you just like keep tabs on it, and then obviously it takes your relationship with the coach, you don't even necessarily need like full deload weeks as long as you're giving them those high and low days
Yeah.
throughout the year. Like it's just unnecessary to take a whole week down
Yeah.
because you are giving them time to recover throughout the week.
Yeah. And that, I think, going off that, I think that's another mistake that is made a lot, is that a complete week, a complete deload week can actually hurt an athlete a lot more the next week when they try to pick back up and think, oh, I deloaded last week, or the coach may think, oh, they deloaded last week, we're gonna hit them hard this week, and then
You build back up to it.
and they're sore, and it's like,
Yeah.
because they went from 4 intense sessions a week to a week doing nothing, or very taking it very easy. That you can definitely be
The communication between the three the other variables that we try to control, right, is like the athletic trainers, coaches, and stuff like that too. But that's something that is like a totally different topic of discussion that we can get into, But it does play a huge role. You're right.
The funniest thing is when a coach has an easy practice and then he tells you to crush them, and
Yeah.
then when they have a hard practice, he tells you to lay off them, and then you're like,
like
then
that's pretty low.
every day is fucking hard. Then every day is hard.
I know. Well, I mean, that's when we went into talking about like how coaches should there should be like a certification to organize practices, in terms of the variables that's being allotted to them and the amount of stress that's being, I know it's hard to do it, but now they have those what is it called? The GPS, this one, the soccer, what do they use?
Load management device. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I also think that that's where it's most likely the strength and conditioning coach's role to kind of step into the sports coach's office and kind of be part of that discussion, planning weekly training sessions. Ideally, how it should be, because in most cases the strength and conditioning coach is going to have a background in periodization or whatever you want to call it, and the sports coach may or may not. But I feel like that's where it's the strength and conditioning coach's job to kind of be part of the planning the training sessions on the field, as well as just doing that thing in the weight room as well.
Mm-hmm.
We're ranting right now.
Yeah.
All right. So last question. Biggest takeaway to the people that would be listening to this, and think about it in like a very general perspective rather than something that's really specific. What would be your biggest takeaway to give to people that are
If you want to train hard, you got to have low days too. To have really high intense days, there has to be low days as well. Because if you like just throw 70-80% effort every single day, that's all you're ever going to get. If you actually commit a day to being like 60-70%, like maybe this is more of a practicing, but in a way you're maybe focusing more on technique or just bar speed, that'll give you you'll be recovered and able to put forth a higher effort that next day. So like having true highs and lows will give you a better opportunity to improve those highs and actually set new records for yourself.
Cool.
I would say one of the biggest things is that, like we've talked about, there are many ways to look at a deload week, and it doesn't have to be just, okay, I'm going to lift at 60% this week. And secondly, that I think more often than not, most athletes can probably handle a lot more in a deload week and it still be effective as a deload. More often than they actually need to really cut back.
Agreed. I think mine would be more is not always better. I think especially the biggest changes I see in young people are the ones that are training really hard and actually love to work out, aka probably like us in high school, that probably could have learned a thing or two about like taking a step back for like a week and then seeing a huge bump in our performance and like numbers. Like I programmed for this guy. It's 19 now, and he like saw tremendous. He's like, man, the bar's like flying up. I've never been able to do this before. And it was like a week. He was usually going like 6 days a week training or 7 days a week training, and then we finally took a step back in like a planned fashion, and he saw like increases, just anecdotal. For the most part, like him saying, I feel better, like I'm moving the bar faster. This is great. I'm glad I did it. So I think that that's a takeaway. Like learn how to, more is not always better, especially with your training. Always going at a young age does it kind of run like you can run into a wall. You'll end up running into a wall eventually, and then you'll just kind of have to be forced. You either get sick or something will happen. You'll be forced to take off that time anyways. Or you can just buy a program from each of us, right, Sam? Right, the SV training. That one's yours, right?
Mm-hmm.
SV training. What's yours, Regan?
Mask.
Mask. And then progressive overload protocol. We forgot to say that we own those too, so we can help people with their programming as well. Cool. All right, guys. I had fun doing that. We'll find a way to post this. Maybe we'll cool little fancy links later on. Like click here.
Maybe we make a podcast.
Or maybe we like dress up differently each week in like different costumes.
You gonna have hair next week?
Huh?
You gonna have hair next week?
I'm gonna grow it out. This was this week. I'm going bald this week. I'll probably change it up next week. Do a blowout. All right,
All
guys.
right. Good talk.
Bye.
See you.